They used to laugh at her. Every morning, same corner. Same rusted food cart. Same tired woman stirring soup before the sun fully rose. And every afternoon, 3 little boys appeared. No shoes. No parents. No future, at least, that's what the world believed. But one morning, years later, 3 Rolls-Royce cars turned onto that forgotten street. People stopped walking. Shopkeepers froze mid-sentence. And the woman holding the soup ladle felt her hands begin to shake. Because the men stepping out of those cars were about to answer a question no one had ever thought to ask: what happens when kindness is planted and left to grow? Stay with me. Because this story doesn't just end with wealth. It ends with truth. Before we begin, if you believe in the power of kindness and want to see where this story goes, hit that subscribe button right now. And drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. We read every single one, and we want to know you're here with us on this journey. Now, let's go back to where it all started. Who were those boys, really? Why did a struggling food vendor choose to feed them every single day when she barely had enough for herself? And what kind of life transforms 3 abandoned children into men powerful enough to arrive in silence, with engines worth more than an entire neighborhood? Most importantly, was this destiny? Or was it the quiet reward of a choice no one noticed? These are the questions that haunt this story. These are the truths that will make you reconsider every small act of kindness you've ever dismissed as meaningless. Her name was Margaret Hale. She wasn't famous. She wasn't educated beyond high school. She didn't dream of riches. Margaret dreamed of peace. After her husband died young, life narrowed. Bills stacked. Friends faded. And grief became her roommate. So she bought a second-hand food cart. And every morning, before the city woke, she cooked. Not gourmet meals. Just soup. Bread. Warm rice. Food that reminded people they were still human. That's when she noticed them. 3 boys. Always together. Always watching from a distance. They never begged. Never spoke. Just watched. Margaret had grown up in a small town in Ohio, the kind of place where everyone knew your business and your grandmother's business too. She'd married Robert Hale when she was 22, young and full of dreams about the life they'd build together. Robert was a mechanic, good with his hands, better with his heart. They'd moved to the city with plans. Big plans. They'd open their own auto shop. Maybe have 3 or 4 kids. Buy a house with a yard where those kids could play. Normal dreams. The kind that seem so simple until life reminds you that simple and easy are not the same thing. Robert died 3 months after their 5th wedding anniversary. Heart attack. No warning. One moment he was laughing at something on television, the next he was clutching his chest, and then he was gone before the ambulance could navigate the city traffic to reach their 3rd-floor walk-up. Margaret was 27 years old and suddenly alone in a way that made the word widow feel like a life sentence. The auto shop dreams died with Robert. The house with the yard became a fantasy for someone else's life. Even the friends they'd made as a couple slowly drifted away, uncomfortable with her grief, unsure how to talk to half of a whole. She worked at a diner for 2 years after Robert passed. Long shifts. Minimum wage. Tips that barely covered bus fare. But it was there, watching the cook work his station, seeing how a simple meal could change someone's entire day, that Margaret started thinking differently about food. It wasn't just sustenance. It was comfort. It was connection. It was the thing that brought people together when words failed. When the diner closed down, victim of a rent increase the owner couldn't absorb, Margaret took her small savings and bought that cart. Used, dented, with wheels that squeaked and a propane system that needed constant attention. But it was hers. The corner of 5th and Marshall wasn't prime real estate. It sat right on the edge where the business district started to crumble into the neighborhood's people with choices avoided. Morning commuters would grab coffee and a breakfast sandwich on their way to offices 6 blocks east. Lunch brought construction crews from the perpetual renovation projects that seemed to multiply like weeds in the city's forgotten spaces. But afternoons were different. Afternoons brought the people the city pretended didn't exist. The homeless. The unemployed. The elderly on fixed incomes who had to choose between medication and meals. The working poor who had jobs but not enough job to actually live on. Margaret kept her prices low. Sometimes too low. Her accountant, a kind man who did her books for free because he felt sorry for her, kept telling her she'd never get ahead charging what she charged. But getting ahead wasn't the point. Getting through the day was the point. Making sure she had a reason to wake up every morning was the point. And somewhere in serving food to strangers, in the small conversations and the thank yous and the regulars who became familiar faces, Margaret found something that looked almost like purpose. That's when she first noticed the boys. It was a Tuesday in September. School had just started, and Margaret remembered thinking it odd that 3 kids who should have been in classrooms were instead hovering near the bus stop across the street. They weren't causing trouble. Weren't bothering anyone. Just standing there, watching. The oldest looked about 9 or 10. Thin, but not yet skeletal. He wore jeans that had been repaired so many times the patches had patches, and a t-shirt that had probably been red once but had faded to a dusty pink. The middle boy, maybe 7 or 8, had these enormous eyes that seemed to absorb everything around him. He clutched a notebook to his chest like it contained state secrets. The youngest couldn't have been more than 5. He held the oldest boy's hand with both of his own, tiny fingers wrapped tight, and he didn't look at Margaret's cart. He looked at his brothers. They came back the next day. And the next. Always at the same time, around 3 in the afternoon when the lunch rush had died and before the dinner crowd would trickle in. Always watching from that same spot across the street. Margaret tried not to stare, but she found herself looking up more often, checking if they were still there. Other vendors had kids who hung around sometimes, hoping for scraps or spare change. But these 3 never approached. Never asked. They just witnessed, like they were memorizing something important. One cold afternoon in late October, Margaret finally broke. The temperature had dropped overnight, sudden and mean the way autumn sometimes turned in the city. She could see her breath. Her fingers were stiff even with gloves. And those 3 boys were standing in the same spot wearing the same thin clothes, no jackets, no hats, nothing between them and the wind that cut down the street like it had a personal grudge. Margaret filled 3 bowls with chicken soup. She'd made it that morning, slow-cooked with real chicken breast that she'd splurged on, vegetables, noodles, the kind of soup that could warm you from the inside out. She added extra bread, buttered it, and set everything on the corner of her cart where they could see it. Then she stepped back. Waited. The boys noticed. She saw the oldest one straighten, alert, cautious. He said something to his brothers. They had a whispered conversation that Margaret couldn't hear. The middle one shook his head. The youngest tugged on the oldest's hand. For a moment, Margaret thought they'd leave. Thought she'd scared them off somehow. But then the oldest boy looked both ways and led his brothers across the street. They approached the cart like it might explode. The oldest spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Is this for us?" Margaret nodded. "Are you hungry?" The smallest one nodded before his brothers could stop him. "Then eat," Margaret said simply. They ate standing up, right there at her cart, bowls clutched in cold hands. They didn't speak. Didn't make eye contact. Just ate with the kind of focus that told Margaret they hadn't seen a meal like this in a while. Maybe a long while. When they finished, the oldest carefully stacked the bowls and set them back on the cart. "Thank you," he said. Then they left, disappearing back into the city as quietly as they'd arrived. Margaret watched them go and felt something shift in her chest. Something that felt dangerously close to hope. From that day on, they came every day. Margaret started preparing for them, setting aside portions before she even opened for business. She never asked their names. It felt like that might break whatever fragile trust they were building. Instead, she gave them names in her head. The oldest became James because he had that serious, responsible energy that reminded her of her grandfather James. The middle one was Daniel, named after a character from a book she'd loved as a child, a boy who was quiet but noticed everything. The youngest was Thomas, her father's name, because there was something about his smile, rare as it was, that reminded her of the way her father used to look at her when she was small and the world still felt safe. The boys never just took the food and left. They helped. James would stack her empty crates without being asked, organizing them by size in a way that actually made her workflow easier. Daniel would sweep around her cart with a broken broom he'd found somewhere, collecting the trash that accumulated throughout the day. And Thomas, little Thomas who couldn't have been more than 5 years old, would smile at her customers. That was his contribution. That smile. And Margaret noticed that people responded to it. They'd order more. Tip better. Come back more frequently. That kid's smile was better marketing than any advertisement she could have afforded. Other vendors noticed too. And they had opinions. Marcus, who ran the coffee cart 2 blocks down, was the first to say something. "You're feeding those street kids again." He shook his head, counting his cash with practiced efficiency. "Margaret, honey, that's a one-way ticket to broke. Those kids got nothing. You think they'll ever pay you back? You think they're sitting on some secret fortune?" Margaret kept stirring her soup. "I don't think about it like that." Marcus laughed, not unkindly, but not gently either. "Well, you should. This is business. You can't afford to be a charity." Rosa, the flower vendor whose cart exploded with color 2 spots down from Margaret's, was gentler but no less concerned. She pulled Margaret aside one afternoon, her weathered hands soft on Margaret's arm. "I know you got a good heart. I know you're trying to do right. But baby, you can barely afford your own rent. I've seen you skip lunch. I've seen you eating the mistakes instead of throwing them out because you can't waste food. How are you going to keep feeding 3 extra mouths when you're not even properly feeding yourself?" Margaret didn't have a good answer. She just knew that not feeding them felt worse than any financial consequence. The truth was, business wasn't great. It was steady enough to keep the cart running, to pay her rent if she was careful, to keep the lights on in her tiny studio apartment. But there was no buffer. No savings. No safety net. One bad week could destroy everything she'd built. One broken piece of equipment could mean the end. And yet every afternoon, she filled those 3 bowls. Sometimes, when things were especially tight, she'd make the portions a little smaller for her paying customers and a little larger for the boys. It was probably bad business. It was definitely not sustainable. But Margaret had learned something in the years since Robert died. Sustainability mattered less than surviving the moment in front of you. And in that moment, 3 kids needed food more than she needed an extra $10 in profit. Winter came hard that year. The kind of cold that made the city feel hostile, like it was trying to freeze out anyone who didn't belong. Margaret's fingers went numb every day by noon despite the gloves. Her back ached from hunching against the wind. Business slowed to a crawl because people didn't want to stand outside eating soup when they could barely feel their faces. She started dipping into the small emergency fund she'd been building, watching it shrink with each passing week. Her landlord sent the first warning in January. Rent was late. Again. He was understanding, he said, but his understanding had limits. The boys showed up every day, rain or snow or bitter wind. Their clothes never seemed to get any warmer. James developed a cough that worried Margaret deeply. Daniel's hands were always red and chapped. Thomas stopped smiling as much, and Margaret missed it more than she would have expected. She wanted to do more. Wanted to buy them coats, take them somewhere warm, ask the questions that might actually help. But something held her back. Instinct, maybe. Or fear that asking too much would make them disappear entirely. One particularly brutal afternoon in February, James showed up with a split lip. The bottom one was swollen, crusted with dried blood at the corner. Daniel had a bruise spreading across his left cheek, purple and angry and fresh. Thomas was limping, favoring his right leg in a way that made Margaret's stomach turn. She stopped stirring and just looked at them. What happened? James wouldn't meet her eyes. Nothing. That's not nothing. We're fine. His voice was firm despite the split lip, despite being 9 years old and very obviously not fine. James. We're fine, he repeated. And something in his tone told Margaret not to push. Some secrets were too dangerous to speak aloud. She fed them extra that day. Made them sit at the small bench she kept for customers who couldn't stand long. She gave them hot chocolate, a luxury she couldn't afford, but found she could not afford either. They sat and ate and said nothing, and Margaret busied herself cleaning things that were already clean because watching them hurt and not being able to help hurt worse. When they finally left, moving carefully like their bodies were cataloging new pains, Margaret stood at her cart and cried for the first time since Robert's funeral. Quiet tears that she wiped away quickly because crying didn't change anything. Crying didn't feed hungry kids or heal split lips or stop whatever was happening to them in the hours she couldn't see. And then one day, they stopped coming. It was a Thursday in March. Margaret prepared their portions as usual. Set them aside. Waited. 3 o'clock came and went. 4 o'clock. 5. The soup got cold. She reheated it, convinced they were just running late. Maybe they'd had to do something. Maybe they'd gotten held up. 6 o'clock. Sunset. The streets emptied as the business crowd went home and the night crowd wasn't out yet. Margaret packed up her cart in the growing darkness, 3 full bowls sitting untouched, and felt panic start to build in her chest. Friday, no boys. Saturday, no boys. Sunday she was closed, and she spent the entire day walking the neighborhood, looking for 3 kids who might not want to be found. Monday she opened her cart with 3 portions set aside, hope and dread competing in her throat. No one came. Tuesday. Wednesday. Thursday. A week became 2 weeks. 2 weeks became a month. Margaret asked everyone. The other vendors, the regular customers, the police officer who walked the beat and knew everyone's business. No one had seen 3 boys matching their description. It was like they'd vanished into the same streets that had produced them. She went to the shelters. Showed up at the doors of places she'd never entered before, places that smelled of industrial cleaner and desperation, places where tired staff with too many cases and not enough resources listened patiently and then shook their heads. No new boys. No trio of brothers. Nothing. She walked alleys she probably shouldn't have walked alone, asking questions of people who faded back into shadows when they saw her coming. She checked the hospitals, terrified of what she might find, relieved and somehow more worried when she found nothing. After 6 weeks, reality settled in her chest like ice. They were gone. Dead, maybe. Split up by the system. Moved to another city. Or just moved to another corner of this city, avoiding her for reasons she'd never understand. Whatever the answer, they weren't coming back. Margaret returned to her routine, but it felt hollow now. She still set aside 3 portions every afternoon for the first month. Then every few days. Then only on Thursdays, the day they'd disappeared. Then not at all, because hope is a finite resource and hers had finally run dry. Years moved on. Margaret turned 55, then 60. Her hair went from brown to gray to white. Her hands, never beautiful, became knotted with arthritis that made the morning prep work painful. The cart grew older along with her, more rust than metal in some places, held together by habit and stubbornness. The city changed around her. Buildings went up. Buildings came down. The neighborhood that had been rough but familiar became rough and unrecognizable. Chain stores replaced family businesses. Rent prices climbed. People with money moved in, and people without money moved out or into the margins where cities keep the evidence of their failures. But Margaret stayed. Her cart remained anchored to that corner of Fifth and Marshall like a lighthouse that refused to move even as the shore eroded beneath it. She told herself she'd moved on from those 3 boys. That they'd been a brief chapter in a long book, meaningful but over. But the truth lived in her habits. In the way she still glanced up around 3 o'clock, just checking. In the way she over-prepared soup, always making more than she could sell, just in case. In the way she looked twice at any trio of kids, any 3 people moving together with that particular kind of closeness. Her regulars became her family. Old Mr. Patterson bought coffee every single morning, 6:30 like clockwork, and told the same stories about World War II. Margaret had heard about his time in France approximately 300 times, but she listened every time like it was new because Mr. Patterson's daughter never called and his son lived in California, and those stories were how he proved to himself that his life had mattered. Young Maria, the nurse who worked the overnight shift at the hospital 6 blocks away, showed up at dawn 3 times a week for soup and bread. She'd eat standing up, already exhausted before her day even started, and Margaret would pack her an extra container to take home because nurses saved lives but couldn't seem to save themselves from exploitation. The construction crew from the perpetual renovation projects adopted Margaret's cart as their unofficial headquarters. 5 guys, rotating depending on the job, who argued about football and politics and whose wife was the worst cook, all while inhaling rice and beans and sandwiches. They were loud and sometimes crude but always respectful, always tipped well, and always made sure no one bothered Margaret. More than once, they'd run off teenagers who thought it would be funny to mess with the old lady's cart. They were protection she'd never asked for but had come to depend on. These people kept her going. Kept her cart open. Kept her believing that what she did mattered, even in small ways. But there were hard days. Days when her knees screamed with arthritis and climbing out of bed felt like climbing a mountain. Days when the propane tank was empty and she couldn't afford to refill it until next week, so she'd close early and lose the income she desperately needed. Days when teenagers would knock over her condiment bottles for fun, laughing as she bent down to clean the mess, her back protesting every movement. Days when the weather was so bad that no one came, and she'd stand at her cart losing money with every hour that passed but unable to close because what if someone needed her? She thought about quitting. The thoughts came more frequently as she got older, as her body made its protests louder, as the gap between her income and her expenses grew wider. She thought about selling the cart, finding a quiet room somewhere, maybe one of those senior living facilities where meals were provided and she could finally rest. She'd imagine it sometimes, late at night when her hands ached too much to sleep. No more waking at 4 in the morning. No more standing on concrete for 12 hours. No more counting pennies and hoping the propane lasted one more day. Just quiet. Just peace. But every time she got close to that decision, close to actually making the calls and setting the wheels in motion, she'd remember 3 boys who'd needed someone to see them. And she'd wonder if someone else out there needed the same thing. What if she closed the cart and the next day someone showed up hungry, expecting her to be there? What if her absence was the final proof someone needed that the world didn't care? She couldn't bear it. So she stayed. 10 years after the boys disappeared, Margaret turned 65. Medicare kicked in, which helped with the basics but didn't touch the dental work she needed or the new glasses that might let her read her own handwriting. Her doctor said her blood pressure was dangerously high. Her back needed surgery she couldn't afford. The arthritis in her hands was progressive, meaning it would get worse, not better. Some mornings, getting out of bed felt like an achievement worth celebrating. But still, she'd heat the soup. Still, she'd set up the cart. Still, she'd smile at strangers and ask if they'd eaten. Because the alternative was admitting that all those years, all that effort, all that love poured into 3 forgotten boys had been for nothing. And Margaret refused to believe the universe worked that way. She had to believe that kindness mattered. That small acts accumulated into something larger. That somewhere, somehow, those boys were okay. Maybe they didn't remember her. Maybe they did but couldn't come back. Maybe they were dead, and all her hoping was just a way to avoid grief. She didn't know. Would never know. But she had to believe it meant something. Then came the rumors. Someone had bought the entire block. Development, they called it. Luxury apartments. Artisan shops. Organic markets. Coffee places that charged $7 for drinks with more syllables than ingredients. Places where a rusted food cart wouldn't fit the aesthetic vision. Places where the people who actually needed affordable food wouldn't be able to afford to live. Margaret received the notice on a Tuesday afternoon. Certified mail. Very official. 60 days to vacate. No exceptions. No negotiations. The city had approved the development. The old businesses were out. Progress was in. She read the letter 3 times, standing at her cart between the lunch and dinner rush, hands trembling so badly the paper rattled. 60 days. That was it. 2 months to figure out what came next after 23 years of this corner being her purpose. She folded the letter carefully, precisely, and put it in her apron pocket. Then she went back to serving soup because there were still people who needed to eat and breaking down in public wouldn't change anything. That night, alone in her studio apartment that overlooked an alley and a dumpster, Margaret sat at her tiny kitchen table and cried for the second time since Robert died. Not for herself. But for the people who needed that corner, that cart, that bowl of soup that reminded them someone still cared they existed. The other vendors had already received their notices. Most had already left. Marcus took a buyout, enough money to finally retire like he'd been threatening to do for years. He moved to Florida, sent Margaret a postcard of a beach with water too blue to be real. Rose's daughter had been begging her to move to Ohio for years. The notice was the push she needed. She sold her cart to a young couple who wanted to start a flower business in a neighborhood where people could afford flowers. Mr. Chen, who'd sold newspapers from the same corner for 40 years, simply stopped showing up one day. Margaret heard he'd had a stroke. Heard he was in a nursing home. Heard he'd given up, and giving up had broken something fundamental. 59 days left. 58. 57. Margaret kept counting down, each number a step closer to the edge of a cliff she couldn't see the bottom of. She kept serving. Kept cooking. Kept pretending she had a plan. People asked what she'd do next. She said she was figuring it out. She said she had options. She said she'd be fine. All lies. She had no plan. No options. No idea what came after this except maybe nothing. Mr. Patterson brought her information about food trucks, trying to be helpful, but food trucks required licenses and inspections and startup capital Margaret didn't have. Maria suggested she apply to work at the hospital cafeteria, but they weren't hiring, and even if they were, Margaret's back couldn't handle that kind of work anymore. The corner felt like a graveyard. The empty spaces where other vendors used to set up seemed to accuse her. Why are you still here? Why haven't you figured it out? Why are you always the last one holding on to things that are already gone? Margaret didn't have good answers. She just knew that leaving felt like one more death, one more piece of her life that the world had decided wasn't valuable enough to keep. First Robert. Then the boys. Now this. At some point, there'd be nothing left of her except an old woman with no one and nowhere, and that thought terrified her more than she wanted to admit. 30 days left. 20. 10. The construction crew started showing up, walking the block with clipboards and measuring tapes, talking in acronyms about load-bearing walls and zoning requirements. They looked at Margaret's cart like it was trash someone had forgotten to remove. One of them, young enough to be her grandson, told her she needed to clear out sooner rather than later to avoid complications. She asked what kind of complications. He didn't answer, just walked away, and Margaret understood that she'd become an inconvenience to progress. 5 days left. Margaret started packing her cart each night, taking the things she wouldn't need the next day back to her apartment. Spare ladles. Extra containers. The coffee maker that had brewed thousands of cups. Each item felt heavier than it should, weighted with memories and meaning that no one else would understand. This ladle had fed the boys. This pot had made soup for Mr. Patterson when he'd been sick. These containers had carried meals to Maria when she'd been too tired to eat standing up. They weren't just things. They were evidence that she'd mattered. 3 days left. 2 days. 1. Margaret opened her cart on the final day knowing it was the final day. She'd made extra soup, enough for everyone who might come. Mr. Patterson showed up at 6:30 like always, and when she told him this was the last day, he cried. Actual tears running down his weathered face. "Where will I go?" he asked, and Margaret didn't have an answer because where would any of them go? Maria came by at dawn and didn't say anything, just hugged Margaret for a long time, and Margaret felt the younger woman shaking with tears she was trying not to shed. The construction crew came by together, all 5 of them, and handed her an envelope. Cash. More than her last week's profit. "You've been feeding us for 3 years, the foreman said gruffly. "This doesn't cover it, but it's what we got." The final hours passed too quickly and too slowly. Every person who'd ever been a regular seemed to show up, like the neighborhood had sent out some silent signal that this was the end. People Margaret had fed for years, some who'd never said more than their order, came by to say goodbye. To say thank you. To say her cart had mattered. An elderly man she'd given free coffee to every Friday for the past 5 years pressed a crumpled 20 into her hand and shuffled away before she could refuse. A young mother with 2 kids hugged her and said, "You fed us when I had nothing. I'll never forget." A homeless man who'd never bought anything but she'd fed anyway brought her a flower he'd clearly picked from someone's garden and said it was the only payment he could afford. By 7 o'clock that evening, Margaret had packed everything. The cart stood empty, gutted, just a metal skeleton of what it had been. She ran her hand along the surface, feeling every dent and scratch, remembering the stories each one held. 23 years. Thousands of meals. Hundreds of people. 3 boys who changed everything without knowing it. And now it was over. She locked the cart one final time, turned away from the corner that had been her entire world, and walked toward whatever came next with no idea what that would be. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with, "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this story. And if Margaret's struggle is hitting you emotionally, hit that like button. Because what happens next, what happens when those 3 Rolls-Royce cars arrive, will change everything you think you know about this story. Stay with me. What Margaret didn't know, couldn't have known as she walked away from her cart that final evening, was that 15 years earlier, on that Thursday in March when the boys disappeared, their lives had changed forever. This is their story. The story of what happened after they vanished from Margaret's corner. The story of 3 boys who'd been invisible to the world but not to one woman with a soup ladle and a heart that refused to quit. The day they stopped coming to Margaret's cart wasn't a choice. It was a rescue. Or at least, that's what the authorities called it. The boys called it something else. They called it the day everything fell apart. James, whose real name was actually Marcus Thompson, had been 9 years old. Daniel, really Christopher Thompson, had been 7. And Thomas, born Samuel Thompson, had been 5. They were brothers, biological brothers, which was rare in the system and made them both blessed and cursed. Blessed because they had each other. Cursed because the system preferred to split siblings up. Easier to place 1 kid than 3. Their mother had died when Samuel was 3. Cancer that had spread before anyone caught it, the kind of death that came from being poor and uninsured and used to ignoring pain because acknowledging it cost money they didn't have. Their father had tried. God, he'd tried. But grief and 3 kids and a job that barely paid enough for one were a combination that broke him slowly and then all at once. He started drinking. Then he started missing work. Then he lost the job. Then the apartment. Then, in a moment that had probably felt like mercy in his broken mind, he dropped them at a fire station and driven away. They never saw him again. The system swallowed them. They bounced through 2 foster homes in 6 months, each one worse than the last. The first family had seemed nice enough initially, but the father had a temper that exploded without warning, and James, trying to protect his younger brothers, became the target. The second home had too many kids and not enough supervision. Food was scarce. Attention was non-existent. When the middle child turned violent toward Samuel, the boys decided running was safer than staying. They'd lived on the streets for 3 months before they found Margaret's corner. 3 months of hiding in abandoned buildings, of stealing food when they had to, of protecting each other because no one else would. They'd learn quickly which streets to avoid, which cops would look the other way, which shelters asked too many questions. They'd learn to be invisible, to take up no space, to need nothing from a world that had made it clear they were expendable. Margaret had been the first adult in their lives who'd given without requiring something in return. Who'd fed them without asking for their story. Who'd looked at them and seen people instead of problems. For 3 months, that cart had been the only reliable thing in their chaotic existence. Every afternoon at 3 o'clock, they'd get food and a smile and a few moments of pretending they were normal kids doing normal things. It had been enough to keep them going. More than enough. It had been everything. Then came the social worker. Her name was Diane Chen, and she'd been in the field for 20 years, long enough to have seen every variation of child suffering the world could produce. She'd noticed the boys because she noticed everything, and 3 kids showing up at the same food cart every day at the same time was a pattern. Patterns meant stability. Stability in street kids meant something worth investigating. She'd watched from a distance for a week, documenting, observing, building a case. When she finally approached them, it was at Margaret's cart, after they'd eaten, when their guards were lowest. "I need you to come with me," she'd said. Not a request. James, protective James who'd been parenting his brothers since he was 6, had stepped in front of Christopher and Samuel. "We didn't do anything wrong." "I know," Diane had said gently. "But you're kids, and kids need homes, and I'm going to find you one." "We're fine." "You're not fine. You're 9 years old with a split lip, and your brother has frostbite starting on his toes, and the little one hasn't spoken in a week. That's not fine." She'd been right, but rightness didn't make it easier. They'd fought. Screamed. Samuel, silent Samuel, had finally cried, and the sound had broken something in all of them. But Diane Chen was patient and persistent and more powerful than 3 scared kids. They'd gone with her. Been processed. Been examined by doctors who catalogued their injuries with clinical detachment. Been assigned case numbers that reduced their entire existence to digits in a database. And then they'd been separated. James went to a group home first. 14 boys in a house meant for 8. Chaos and hierarchy and violence as currency. He'd lasted 2 months before running away, trying to find his brothers, but the system caught him and sent him somewhere else. Then somewhere else. Then somewhere else. 6 placements in 18 months. Each one another failure. Another proof that he was unlovable, unwanted, too damaged to fix. He'd stopped hoping for better. Stopped imagining a life that didn't hurt. Started believing what the world kept telling him, that he was worth nothing and would amount to less. Then he met Richard Patterson. Not the Mr. Patterson from Margaret's cart, but a high school teacher named Richard who'd taken in foster kids for 15 years because his own childhood had been hell and he remembered what it felt like to believe no one cared. Richard had 3 rules. Tell the truth. Do your homework. Show up to dinner. That was it. No violence. No screaming. No chaos. Just routine and expectations, and someone who believed James could be more than his worst moments. It took James 6 months to trust it. To believe Richard wasn't going to explode or disappear or hurt him. To accept that this man actually cared about whether he passed algebra and brushed his teeth and had dreams beyond survival. Richard had been patient through every test James threw at him. Every broken rule. Every punishment James seemed to invite, because punishment was familiar and kindness was terrifying. And slowly, so slowly James barely noticed, something shifted. He started doing homework. Started reading books. Started imagining a future that extended past next week. Richard taught him about systems. How they worked. How to navigate them. How to use them instead of being used by them. "You're smart," Richard had told him one night while they were washing dishes. Like scary smart. But smart doesn't matter if you don't have the credentials the world requires. So get the credentials. Graduate. Go to college. Prove them all wrong. James had laughed, bitter and disbelieving. College costs money. Everything costs something, Richard had replied. Question is whether you're willing to pay the price. James graduated high school with honors. Got scholarships. Worked 2 jobs to cover what the scholarships didn't. Went to college angry and determined to prove that poor kids who'd lived on streets could be just as good as rich kids who'd never known hunger. He studied political science and then law, driven by a fury at the systems that had failed him and his brothers. Every late night studying. Every exam. Every paper. He thought about Margaret. About the woman who'd fed him when she had no reason to. About how small acts of kindness had kept him alive long enough to become someone who could fight back. Christopher's journey was different but equally hard. He'd been placed with an elderly couple first, the Hendersons, who'd been kind but ultimately too old to handle a traumatized 7-year-old. When Mr. Henderson fell and broke his hip, Christopher was moved again. Then again. 4 homes in 2 years. Each move carved away a piece of his belief that stability existed. Each new family felt like a countdown to the inevitable goodbye. He stopped unpacking his belongings. Kept everything in his backpack, ready to run or be moved at a moment's notice. The notebook he'd clutched at Margaret's cart went everywhere with him. Inside, he'd started drawing. Buildings, mostly. Structures. Bridges. Things that were permanent, that couldn't be moved or destroyed by human whims. He'd fill page after page with architectural sketches, teaching himself perspective and proportion from library books because art classes weren't available in the schools he bounced between. The notebook became his constant, the one thing that moved with him, that held all the parts of himself he couldn't speak aloud. His breakthrough came through tragedy. The 5th home he was placed in had a father who was an engineer, David Martinez. David worked for a firm that designed infrastructure, and he had a home office filled with blueprints and models and computer programs that could render 3-dimensional structures from mathematical equations. Christopher had been caught sneaking into that office one night, trying to understand how the models worked. Instead of punishment, David had sat down with him and explained. Then explained more. Then started teaching him. David saw what everyone else had missed. Christopher wasn't just drawing buildings. He was solving problems. Figuring out how weight distributed. How forces transferred. How structures stood or fell based on principles that could be calculated and predicted. You have an engineer's mind, David had told him, and Christopher had felt something he'd almost forgotten. Pride. Possibility. David fought to keep Christopher when the social worker tried to move him again. Fought hard enough that he and his wife eventually adopted him. Gave him stability. Gave him their name. Gave him a future. Christopher threw himself into education with an obsession that worried his new parents. He skipped lunch to study. Stayed up until 2 in the morning working through calculus problems that wouldn't be assigned for another 2 years. Taught himself programming languages and CAD software. Applied to every scholarship he could find. Got into MIT on a full ride and graduated in 3 years instead of 4 because waiting felt impossible. Started his own engineering firm at 25, using loans and credit cards and the kind of reckless confidence that comes from having nothing to lose because you've already lost everything that mattered. His first major contract was designing a homeless shelter. He did it for half his usual fee, and when the nonprofit couldn't pay even that, he did it for free. Because somewhere in the back of his mind lived the memory of 3 boys sleeping in abandoned buildings, and he couldn't design luxury condos while people who looked like his younger self froze on streets. His firm grew. His designs won awards. His patents made him wealthy beyond anything he'd imagined. But every building he designed, he thought about Margaret. About the woman who'd seen him when he was invisible. About how her kindness had given him a reason to keep existing long enough to become someone who could build things that lasted. Samuel's story nearly ended before it began. At 5 years old, separated from his brothers, he'd stopped speaking entirely. Stopped eating. Stopped engaging with the world in any meaningful way. He was diagnosed with selective mutism and failure to thrive, medical terms for a soul that had shattered and didn't know how to put itself back together. He went through 3 placements in 6 months, each family overwhelmed by a child who seemed determined to disappear even while physically present. The system was preparing to institutionalize him, to place him in a facility for children too damaged for traditional foster care. Then Maria Gonzalez happened. Maria owned a small Mexican restaurant in a neighborhood where most businesses failed within a year. She'd never planned to be a foster parent. Never planned to have kids at all. But her priest had asked, and Maria had a hard time saying no to people who needed help, and the social worker had been desperate. Just temporary, they'd said. Just until we find something more permanent. Temporary became 6 months. 6 months became a year. And somewhere in there, Samuel started speaking again. It started with food. Maria cooked the way Margaret had cooked, with love and attention and the belief that feeding someone was the most basic way to show you cared. She never forced Samuel to eat. Just put plates in front of him and ate her own food, talking to him like he was responding even when he sat silent. Telling him about her day. Her customers. The funny things that happened in a restaurant. Asking his opinion on recipes like he was a consultant whose input mattered. And slowly, over weeks and then months, Samuel started eating. Then started helping in the kitchen. Then, one afternoon while peeling potatoes, started talking. My brothers used to like potatoes, he'd said, his voice rusty from disuse. Maria had frozen, potato peeler in mid-air, terrified that responding wrong would send him back into silence. Yeah. Tell me about your brothers. And Samuel did. For the first time in over a year, he talked about Marcus and Christopher. About living on the streets. About being cold and hungry and scared. And about a woman with a food cart who'd fed them every day without asking questions. She was nice, Samuel had said, and then he'd cried, and Maria had held him while he fell apart and started putting himself back together. Maria fought the system to keep him. Filled out paperwork. Went to court. Dealt with bureaucrats who couldn't understand why a single restaurant owner wanted to adopt a traumatized kid when she worked 80 hours a week and barely scraped by. But Maria was stubborn, and more importantly, Samuel wanted to stay. The judge saw a child who'd finally found stability and decided not to disrupt it. The adoption went through when Samuel was 7, and Maria became the mother he'd thought he'd lost forever. Growing up in a restaurant taught Samuel things school never could. How to work hard. How to handle pressure. How to turn chaos into order. How to read people and anticipate needs before they were spoken. He started helping in the kitchen officially when he was 10, washing dishes and prepping vegetables. By 12, he was working the line on busy nights. By 15, he was creating new recipes, fusion dishes that combined Maria's traditional cooking with techniques he'd taught himself from cookbooks and cooking shows. By 17, he was managing the restaurant while Maria recovered from the cancer that had come quietly and viciously. Maria survived, but it was close, and the medical bills destroyed what little savings she'd accumulated. Samuel had to make a choice. College or keeping the restaurant alive. He chose the restaurant, worked doubles, took out loans, expanded the menu to attract customers who'd never considered Mexican food before. Food critics started noticing. Then local news. Then national food magazines. By 23, Samuel had 3 restaurants. By 27, he had 15. By 30, he had a chain of community kitchens that operated on a pay-what-you-can model because he'd never forgotten what it felt like to be hungry with no money and no options. But through all of it, through every success and failure and long night when the past felt too heavy to carry, all 3 brothers thought about Margaret. They didn't know her name. Didn't know if she was even still alive. But they remembered. Marcus remembered her patience. Christopher remembered her consistency. Samuel remembered her kindness. And when they'd each finally found stability, found success, found lives that looked nothing like those 3 boys on that corner, they'd started searching. It took 2 years and a private investigator who specialized in finding people who'd never wanted to be found. They'd given him almost nothing to work with. A corner location. A food cart. A woman who'd been middle-aged 15 years ago. No name. No photographs. Just memories of soup and kindness and someone who'd seen them when everyone else looked away. The investigator had been skeptical. "You're asking me to find a needle in a haystack, except we don't even know what the needle looks like." Marcus had handed him a check. "Then start searching haystacks." The break came from an unlikely source. A food blog. Someone had written an article about disappearing street vendors, the mom-and-pop operations that were being erased by gentrification and development. The article included old photographs, nostalgia pieces about the character the city was losing. And there, in a photo taken 6 years earlier, was Margaret's cart. The rusted corners. The handwritten menu board. And partially visible in the frame, a woman's hand stirring a pot. The blog identified the location. 5th and Marshall. The investigator called Marcus. "I think I found her corner." "Did you find her?" "Working on it." Finding the corner was easy. Finding Margaret took longer. The cart was gone. The block was scheduled for demolition. But the investigator was thorough. He talked to other vendors who remembered Margaret. Tracked down her old customers. Found Mr. Patterson, who'd moved to a nursing home but still talked about the coffee lady who'd listened to his war stories. Found Maria the nurse, who cried when she heard someone was looking for Margaret and gave them the address of the studio apartment where Margaret still lived. "She's not doing well," Maria had said. "She lost her cart 6 months ago. Lost her purpose with it. Tell her Maria misses her." The brothers made a plan. It took 3 months to execute. They didn't want to just show up and hand her money. That felt cheap, transactional, like they were trying to buy their way out of a debt that couldn't be purchased. They wanted to give her something that would last. Something that would let her keep doing what she'd always done, feeding people who needed feeding, but without the struggle that had defined her entire adult life. They bought a property in the new development. A corner space, ground floor, perfect for a restaurant. They hired architects who could design something beautiful but functional. They established the scholarship fund in Robert's name, seeding it with enough money to send 3 kids to college every year in perpetuity. And then, when everything was ready, they came to find her. They'd expected her to still be at the cart. Expected to pull up in their cars and surprise her at the place where their story had started. But when they arrived at 5th and Marshall on that cold morning in November, the corner was empty. Construction equipment. Fencing. Warning signs. No cart. No Margaret. For a moment, all 3 brothers felt panic. What if they were too late? What if she was gone? What if the universe was cruel enough to let them find her only after she disappeared the way they had? Marcus called the investigator. Got the apartment address. They drove there, 3 Rolls-Royce cars navigating streets that seemed narrower than they remembered, pulling up in front of a building that looked one earthquake away from condemnation. They went inside, climbed stairs that creaked warnings with every step, found apartment 3C, and knocked. No answer. Knocked again. Nothing. Christopher tried the door, found it unlocked, called out, "Hello? Margaret?" Still nothing. They found her on the floor. Unconscious. Breathing, thank God, but unresponsive. Samuel called 911 while Marcus checked her pulse and Christopher searched the apartment for medication bottles, medical history, anything that might help the paramedics. The apartment was tiny. Clean but worn. Furniture that had been repaired too many times. A kitchen that smelled faintly of soup even though the stove was cold. And on the table, a stack of bills marked final notice. Eviction papers. A calendar with dates crossed off like she was counting down to something. Or counting down to nothing. The paramedics arrived. Dehydration, they said. Malnutrition. Dangerously low blood pressure. When was the last time she ate? The brothers looked at each other and realized what should have been obvious. Margaret had spent her life feeding others. Had literally given the food from her own mouth to people she thought needed it more. And when the cart closed, when her purpose ended, she just stopped. Stopped eating. Stopped caring for herself. Stopped doing all the things that kept a human body functioning because what was the point of functioning when there was nothing left to function for? They rode with her in the ambulance. Stayed at the hospital while doctors ran tests and started IVs and stabilized the woman who'd saved their lives 15 years ago and was now dying because she'd forgotten how to save her own. A nurse asked who they were. Family? Marcus said yes without hesitation. We're her sons. Not biologically. Not legally. But in every way that mattered, it was true. The nurse nodded, made a note on her chart, and didn't question it further. Margaret woke up 2 days later. Confused. Disoriented. Tubes in her arms and monitors beeping and 3 strange men sitting in her hospital room like sentries. She tried to speak, couldn't, her throat too dry. Samuel held a cup of water with a straw, helped her sip slowly. Easy. You're okay. You're in the hospital. She focused on his face. Something familiar. Something that tugged at memory. Do I know you? Yes, ma'am. You knew us a long time ago. Recognition came slowly. Marcus showed her a photograph the investigator had found, a picture from that old blog post showing her cart. Do you remember this? Margaret nodded, tears already forming. Do you remember 3 boys who came to your cart every afternoon? Who you fed even though we had nothing to give you? Her hand flew to her mouth. The tears fell freely now. Oh my God. Oh my God, it's you. You're them. You're my boys. They spent 3 hours in that hospital room telling her everything. Who they'd become. What they'd built. How every success traced back to that corner, to those afternoons, to a woman who'd proven that someone cared whether they lived or died. Margaret listened and cried and laughed and couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. These weren't just successful men. These were titans in their fields. Marcus ran a legal aid nonprofit that had handled over 10,000 cases. Christopher's engineering firm had designed buildings in 30 countries. Samuel's restaurants had fed over 1 million people. And they were her boys. The 3 hungry kids she'd mourned for 15 years. Why didn't you come back, she finally asked. We tried, Christopher said. After we got stable, we came back to your corner. But you weren't there. We came on Sundays. Margaret closed her eyes. I'm closed on Sundays. Have been for 20 years. It's the only day I rest. Such a small detail. Such a simple explanation. Ships passing in the night for 15 years because of a one-day difference in routine. They told her about the restaurant. About how they'd already purchased the property, already hired the staff, already done everything except find her. It's yours, Marcus said. Fully paid. Fully equipped. You can run it however you want. But we have one condition. Margaret waited. Every day, at least 10 meals get given free to anyone who needs them. No questions. No judgment. Just food and dignity. The way you always did it. She couldn't speak. The weight of it was too much. Not just the gift, but the meaning behind it. They hadn't just remembered her. They'd built their entire adult lives around the lesson she taught them. That kindness mattered. That people mattered. That feeding someone's body could save their soul. I don't know what to say. Say you'll do it, Samuel said. Say you'll keep feeding people. Keep being you. Keep proving that the world has goodness in it. Margaret stayed in the hospital for 5 more days. The brothers visited every day, sometimes all 3 together, sometimes taking shifts so she was never alone. They brought food from Samuel's restaurants, real food that actually tasted like something, not the institutional garbage the hospital served. They brought flowers and books and a tablet loaded with movies because the hospital TV only got 3 channels. They brought stories and laughter and the kind of attention Margaret hadn't experienced since Robert died. Other patients noticed. Nurses gossiped. 3 wealthy men visiting an elderly woman who had no family, treating her like royalty, clearly not doing it for show but because they genuinely cared. It was unusual enough that a local news crew got wind of it. Showed up wanting to do a story. The brothers declined. This isn't about publicity, Marcus told the reporter. This is about paying a debt that can never actually be repaid. Leave her alone. The reporter persisted. Security escorted them out. When Margaret was finally discharged, they didn't take her back to her apartment. They took her to a new one. 2 bedrooms. Clean. Safe. In a building with security and an elevator that worked. Rent paid for 5 years in advance. Furniture that didn't sag or creak. A kitchen with new appliances. Windows that overlooked a park instead of an alley. You can't, Margaret protested. We already did, Christopher said. You're not going back to that place. It's not safe. It's not worthy of you. This is your home now. They gave her a month to recover. To rest. To eat regularly and remember what it felt like to not worry about money every single second. They visited often, bringing groceries and checking on her and making sure she knew this wasn't charity. This was family taking care of family. Maria the nurse came by too, the first time she'd seen Margaret in months, and they cried together about how close they'd come to losing each other. Mr. Patterson came, now 93 but still sharp, still telling his war stories, still grateful for someone who'd listened. The restaurant opened on a Monday in December. They'd wanted Margaret to wait longer, to fully recover, but she'd insisted. I've rested enough. I need to work. I need to feed people. That's who I am. The space was beautiful. Modern but warm. An open kitchen so customers could watch food being prepared. Tables made from reclaimed wood. A mural on the wall showing a food cart on a street corner, 3 small silhouettes approaching, a tribute to where everything started. They'd hired a staff of 12. Cooks who Samuel had trained personally. Servers who understood that this wasn't just a job, this was a mission. A manager who'd worked in nonprofits and knew how to balance business with purpose. But Margaret was the heart. She was there every day, morning until evening, cooking alongside the staff, greeting customers, making sure the free meals were prepared with the same care as the paid ones. Making sure everyone who walked through the door felt seen. The free meal policy drew critics. Other restaurant owners complained it would attract the wrong element. Lower property values. Create safety issues. But Margaret and the brothers stood firm. These are people, Samuel said in an interview he reluctantly gave to stop the controversy. They're hungry people. And if feeding them makes you uncomfortable, examine why that is. Examine what kind of society we've built where caring for our neighbors is considered controversial. The restaurant became successful beyond anyone's expectations. Lines formed before opening. Food critics wrote glowing reviews. But more importantly, it became a gathering place. A community hub. People came for the food and stayed for the atmosphere. Business professionals sat next to construction workers. Families celebrating birthdays sat next to individuals who'd paid nothing because they had nothing. And somehow, in that mixing, in that forced acknowledgement that we're all just people trying to survive, something beautiful happened. Walls broke down. Conversations started. Community built itself organically. Margaret worked the restaurant for 3 years. 3 years of early mornings and sore feet and the deep satisfaction of doing what she was born to do. She trained younger cooks, passing on not just recipes but philosophy. How to cook with love. How to serve with dignity. How to see the person, not the transaction. Some of her trainees went on to open their own restaurants, carrying forward the lessons. Creating their own corners where people mattered. The scholarship fund, the one named after Robert, sent its first 3 students to college in year 1. By year 3, it was sending 12 annually. Marcus had expanded it, recruited other donors, turned it into something bigger than any of them had imagined. They prioritized kids from difficult backgrounds. Foster kids. Homeless youth. Anyone who'd been told they weren't college material because of where they came from. Margaret attended every scholarship dinner, met every recipient, told them her story so they'd know that where you start doesn't determine where you finish. But time catches everyone eventually. Margaret's health declined slowly and then quickly. The arthritis that had always bothered her became debilitating. Her heart, strong for so long, started showing weakness. Her doctors recommended she reduce her hours. Then stop working entirely. She resisted fiercely, but her body made the decision for her. At 72, 3 years after the restaurant opened, Margaret had a stroke. Mild, the doctors said, but a warning. Any more stress could kill her. The brothers pulled her aside. All 3 of them together, presenting a united front. You have to rest, Marcus said. The restaurant will be fine. But the people will be fed, Samuel interrupted. We'll make sure of that. But we can't lose you. Please, Margaret. You saved us once. Let us save you now. She retired. Truly retired this time, not the fake retirement where she kept working anyway. Moved to a small house the brothers had bought, one with a garden and a porch and enough space for the family dinners they'd started having monthly. She spent her days reading and gardening and cooking for herself because some habits never die. The brothers visited often. Brought their own families now. Marcus had married a lawyer he'd met through his nonprofit. Christopher had a wife and 2 daughters who called Margaret grandma. Samuel was engaged to a chef who understood why he did what he did. Margaret met all of them. Became the grandmother figure none of them had ever had. Hosted holidays and birthdays and ordinary Tuesdays when everyone just needed to be reminded they belonged to something. She watched Marcus's twins learn to walk. Taught Christopher's daughters how to make soup. Listened to Samuel's wedding plans with the kind of attention that made him feel valued. This was the family she'd never had. The family that had built itself around shared trauma and shared healing and a mutual understanding that love wasn't about biology. It was about showing up. The restaurant thrived without her daily presence. The staff she'd trained kept her philosophy alive. The free meals continued. The community kept gathering. And Margaret, watching from a distance, felt something she'd never quite felt before. Peace. Real peace. Not just the absence of struggle but the presence of contentment. The knowing that her life had mattered. That the small choices she'd made, the daily decisions to show up and feed people and care when caring was inconvenient, had rippled outward in ways she could never have predicted. One afternoon, 5 years after the restaurant opened, Margaret sat on her porch and did the math. She'd run her cart for 23 years. Served approximately 200 people per day. That was roughly 1.6 million meals from a rusted cart on a forgotten corner. The restaurant had now served 500,000 more. The scholarship fund had sent 87 kids to college. And the 3 boys she'd fed had impacted millions more through their work. Legal aid for the poor. Buildings that housed the homeless. Restaurants that fed the hungry. All of it traced back to soup and kindness and the radical idea that people deserved care without earning it first. She thought about Robert. About how he'd wanted to fix cars and build a life and have kids they'd raise together. They'd had none of that. But maybe, in some strange way, they'd had something bigger. Not the family they'd planned but the family they'd accidentally created. Not the legacy of children but the legacy of changed lives. She hoped Robert could see it. Hoped wherever he was, he knew that the insurance money from his death had bought that cart. That his memory had funded scholarships. That his widow had loved in ways that transformed the world in small, profound increments. The brothers visited that afternoon. No special occasion. Just a regular visit that happened 2 or 3 times a month. They sat on the porch and drank lemonade and talked about nothing important. Christopher's new project designing affordable housing. Samuel's expansion into food trucks that would serve the area's restaurants couldn't reach. Marcus's latest case, a family fighting to stay together against a system designed to tear them apart. Margaret listened and smiled and felt grateful beyond words. "You know what's funny?" she said suddenly. They looked at her. "What's that?" "I thought I was feeding you. All those years ago, I thought I was the one giving." She paused, emotion thick in her throat. "But you fed me too. You gave me purpose when I had none. You gave me a reason to wake up. You saved me as much as I saved you." Marcus reached over and took her hand. "Then we saved each other. And maybe that's how it's supposed to work. Maybe we're all just taking turns being the person who shows up with soup." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the garden Margaret had planted, and she thought about all the small moments that had led here. The decision to buy a cart instead of giving up. The choice to feed 3 boys even when it made no financial sense. The stubborn refusal to quit even when quitting made more sense than continuing. Small choices. Daily choices. Choices that seemed insignificant in the moment but had somehow built a life that mattered. Margaret lived for 7 more years after that conversation. 7 years of watching her accidental family grow and thrive. She saw Marcus's twins graduate high school. Attended Christopher's daughter's piano recitals. Danced at Samuel's wedding and then held his firstborn son with hands that shook with age and emotion. She saw the restaurant expand to 3 locations, each one keeping the same philosophy, the same commitment to feeding anyone who walked through the door. She saw the scholarship fund grow to send 30 students to college annually. She saw her legacy multiply in ways that made her uncomfortable when people called it that because she'd just been feeding people, that's all, just making soup. But everyone else saw differently. Saw a woman who changed countless lives through consistent, unglamorous kindness. Who'd proven that you didn't need wealth or power or influence to make a profound difference. You just needed to show up. To see people. To offer what you could without calculating the return. The city recognized her eventually. Named a park after her. Margaret Hale Park, with benches and a community garden and a bronze plaque that read, "She fed the hungry and nourished the soul." Margaret had attended the dedication ceremony at 78, embarrassed by the attention, insisting she'd done nothing special. But the 3 men standing beside her knew differently. Knew that special wasn't about grand gestures. It was about daily choices. About caring when no one was watching. About believing that every person mattered even when society disagreed. They'd built their entire adult lives around that lesson, and now they were teaching it to their own children. Showing them that success meant nothing if it wasn't shared. That wealth was a responsibility, not a reward. That the measure of a life wasn't what you accumulated but what you gave away. The restaurant started a tradition. Every Thanksgiving, they closed to regular business and served free meals all day. No tickets. No reservations. No proof of need. Just come hungry, leave fed. The first year, they prepared for maybe 200 people. 800 showed up. The line stretched around the block. The brothers rolled up their sleeves and worked the kitchen alongside the staff, serving turkey and stuffing and pie to anyone who came. Margaret had been there too, 80 years old but insisting on helping, ladling gravy with shaking hands because this was what she did. This was who she was. The tradition grew. Local volunteers started showing up to help. Other restaurants contributed food. What started as one restaurant feeding 800 became a citywide effort feeding thousands. And every year, at the end of the night when the last person had been fed and the kitchen was finally cleaned, the brothers and Margaret would sit together and eat their own meal. Cold by then, eaten off paper plates in a parking lot, but it was perfect. It was community. It was love made visible through food and service and the radical act of showing up. Margaret's health failed slowly. She fought it with the same stubbornness she'd applied to everything else in her life. Fought the doctors who said she needed to take it easy. Fought the wheelchair that eventually became necessary. Fought the limitations of a body that had worked hard for 8 decades and was finally demanding rest. But some fights can't be won. At 85, her heart gave its final warning. She was hospitalized. The prognosis wasn't good. Days, maybe a week if they were lucky. The brothers moved into her hospital room. All 3 of them. Set up camp. Worked from laptops when they needed to work, but mostly just sat with her. Held her hand. Told her stories about their kids, their businesses, the community garden that had been planted in her park where homeless individuals were growing vegetables and finding purpose. Reminded her constantly that she was loved. That her life had mattered beyond measure. That she'd changed the trajectory of not just 3 lives but thousands that spiraled out from those 3. Margaret drifted in and out of consciousness. But in the clear moments, she had things she needed to say. Messages for each of them. For Marcus, keep fighting for people who can't fight for themselves. It's the most important work anyone can do. For Christopher, build beautiful things but never forget the people who live in them. Purpose without people is just ego. For Samuel, feed them. Keep feeding them. Food is how we show love to strangers. And for all of them, you were never a burden. You were never unwanted. You were my boys then and you're my boys now. I'm so proud of who you've become. She asked them to promise something. To keep the restaurant going. To keep the free meals. To keep the scholarship fund. To make sure the lessons didn't die with her. To pass it forward the way she tried to do. They promised. They would have promised her anything. Would have carved their promises into stone if she'd asked. Because she'd given them everything. Not money. Not things. But the foundational belief that they deserved to exist in the world. That they mattered. That their lives had value. Everything else had grown from that seed. Margaret died on a Tuesday morning in April. Peacefully, the nurses said, though how you measure peace at the end of life is subjective at best. The brothers were all there. Holding her hands. Telling her it was okay to let go. That they'd be okay. That she'd done enough. More than enough. That she could rest now. Her last words were barely a whisper. Take care of each other. Then she was gone, and the 3 men who'd built empires felt like children again, lost and grieving and profoundly grateful to have had her at all. The funeral was massive. Over 1,000 people. Former customers from the cart. Current customers from the restaurants. Scholarship recipients. Random people whose lives she'd touched in ways they'd never forgotten. The brothers had wanted something small, something private, but Margaret's impact couldn't be contained. People needed to mourn. Needed to honor. Needed to acknowledge that the world was diminished by her absence. The service was held at a church that could barely contain everyone. People stood in the aisles. Sat on the floor. Overflowed into the parking lot where speakers broadcast the service. Marcus gave the eulogy. Struggled through it. Broke down twice but kept going because this was important. He told the story of 3 homeless boys and a woman with a food cart. Told it plainly, without embellishment, because the truth needed no decoration. She saved our lives, he said, voice cracking. Not once. Every day. 4 months. When the world had decided we were disposable, she decided we mattered. And that decision changed everything. He looked out at the crowd. How many of you are here because Margaret fed you? Literally or metaphorically? How many of you felt seen by her when everyone else looked through you? Hands went up. Dozens. Hundreds. Nearly everyone. And Marcus understood then what they'd all known but never quite articulated. Margaret hadn't just fed bodies. She'd fed souls. Reminded people of their own humanity when the world tried to strip it away. Proved that kindness wasn't weakness. That caring wasn't foolish. That small acts accumulated into legacies that outlived the people who performed them. She was ordinary, Marcus continued. That's what made her extraordinary. She was one person with limited resources doing what she could with what she had. And that was enough. That was more than enough. She changed the world by changing the people in front of her. One bowl of soup at a time. The burial was private. Just the brothers and their families. They laid her next to Robert, the husband she'd mourned for 60 years, together again in whatever came next. Christopher's daughters sang. Samuel's wife read a poem about love and loss and the threads that connect us across time. And the 3 men stood together, arms around each other's shoulders, and cried for the woman who'd been their mother in every way that counted. But grief wasn't the end. Margaret would have hated that. Would have told them to stop crying and start cooking because people were hungry and wallowing helped no one. So they channeled the grief into action. Expanded the scholarship fund to send 50 students to college annually. Opened 2 more restaurants, both in underserved neighborhoods, both committed to the free meal policy. Established the Margaret Hale Foundation, dedicated to supporting individuals and organizations that fed the hungry without judgment or requirement. Funded food carts in 12 cities, giving aspiring vendors the equipment and training to start their own businesses with the understanding that some meals would always be free. The foundation's logo was a soup ladle. Simple. Recognizable. A reminder of where it all started. And every year on Margaret's birthday, the foundation hosted a day of service. Thousands of volunteers in dozens of cities serving free meals to anyone who showed up. They called it Soup Day. Margaret would have found that embarrassingly on the nose. But she also would have loved it. Would have been there ladling soup with trembling hands because that's who she was until the very end. The brothers stayed close. Closer than most biological families. They had Sunday dinners at each other's homes, rotating hosting duties. Their children grew up as cousins, playing together, fighting together, learning together the lessons about kindness and service that their fathers taught through example rather than lecture. They knew Margaret's story. Knew that they existed because a stranger had cared enough to feed 3 hungry boys. And they understood the responsibility that came with that knowledge. To care forward. To pay it ahead. To be the reason someone else's story has a better chapter. Marcus's legal nonprofit grew to have offices in 15 states. They handled everything from housing disputes to immigration cases to juvenile justice reform. And at the heart of every case was Margaret's question, does this person matter? The answer was always yes. Always. No exceptions. No qualifications. People mattered because they were people, and that was reason enough. Christopher's engineering firm designed buildings for beauty and function, but they also designed with purpose. Homeless shelters that felt like homes. Low-income housing that had dignity. Community centers that brought neighborhoods together. Every blueprint asked, who benefits? And the answer had to include everyone, not just the people with money. Samuel's restaurant empire topped 30 locations across 8 states. But empire was misleading. These weren't corporate franchises churning profit. These were community kitchens that happened to be financially sustainable. Every location kept the same promise. 10 free meals minimum per day. No questions. No judgment. Some locations served far more than 10. Some days it was 50. Some days 100. It didn't matter. The food was there. The dignity was there. The message was there, you deserve to eat. You deserve to be seen. You deserve to exist without justifying your existence. And every year, on the anniversary of the day those 3 Rolls-Royce cars had pulled up to Margaret's corner, the brothers returned to 5th and Marshall. The block had been completely transformed. Luxury apartments. Boutique shops. Coffee places with names that sounded like law firms. But on that corner, the exact corner where Margaret's cart had stood for 23 years, there was a sculpture. Bronze. Life-sized. A woman standing behind a food cart, ladle in hand, serving 3 children who looked up at her with hope in their faces. The plaque read, Margaret Hale. 1940 to 2025, she fed us all. The brothers would stand there for an hour, sometimes longer. Remembering. Grieving. Celebrating. Tourists would take pictures, not knowing the story. Local residents would nod respectfully, recognizing the tribute even if they didn't know the details. And occasionally, someone would approach the brothers, recognizing them from news articles or business magazines, and ask about the sculpture. About the woman. About why 3 successful men spent an hour every year standing in silence at a corner that meant nothing to anyone else. And they'd tell the story. Tell it every time, never tired of the telling because some stories deserve to be repeated until everyone knows them by heart. They'd talk about being hungry and cold and invisible. About a woman who'd seen them when no one else bothered. About soup that tasted like hope. About kindness that asked for nothing in return. About how one person's daily choice to show up and care had rippled through decades and touched millions of lives. She saved us, they'd always conclude. And then we tried to save her back. But really, we just kept passing it forward. That's what she would have wanted. The foundation tracked impact. Not because Margaret would have cared about numbers, but because funders did and funding allowed the work to continue. In the 15 years after Margaret's death, the foundation served 18 million free meals. The scholarship fund sent over 700 students to college, with a 92% graduation rate far exceeding national averages. The legal nonprofit won 78% of its cases, keeping families together, preventing wrongful deportations, securing housing for people one bad month away from homelessness. Christopher's firm employed over 2,000 people and had designed buildings that housed 40,000 individuals who'd previously been homeless. But the real impact couldn't be measured. Couldn't be quantified in spreadsheets or annual reports. It lived in the 12-year-old girl who ate free lunch at one of Samuel's restaurants every day and didn't drop out of school because hunger didn't distract her anymore. In the single mother who got legal help from Marcus's nonprofit and kept custody of her kids when the system tried to take them for being poor. In the family living in affordable housing that Christopher designed, housing that didn't feel like punishment for not having money. In the college graduate who'd been a foster kid, who'd gotten a scholarship from Margaret's fund, who now ran her own nonprofit helping other foster kids because someone had helped her first. It lived in ripples. In patterns. In the way kindness reproduces itself when it's planted in fertile ground. Margaret had planted it in 3 boys. They'd planted it in thousands. Those thousands would plant it in millions. And somewhere in that exponential growth was the answer to the question nobody had asked but everyone wondered, does kindness actually matter? Can one person really change the world? The answer was yes. But not in the way people expected. Not in grand gestures or viral moments or dramatic transformations. In daily choices. In showing up. In doing the small thing right in front of you without calculating whether it makes a difference because the calculation misses the point. The point is the doing. The caring. The decision that people matter more than profit, more than convenience, more than the 1,000 reasons we tell ourselves we can't help. Marcus thought about this often. He was 62 now, older than Margaret had been when she'd first fed them. His kids were grown. His non-profit was stable. He could retire if he wanted. But retirement felt like betrayal. Margaret had worked until her body wouldn't let her anymore. How could he do less? So he kept taking cases. Kept fighting systems that chewed up people and spit them out. Kept believing that justice was possible if enough people cared enough to make it happen. Some days he won. Some days he lost. But every day he showed up, and showing up was its own form of resistance against a world that would prefer he give up. Christopher was 60 now. His firm was legendary. Architecture students studied his designs. Awards lined his office walls. He could design anything now, anywhere, for anyone willing to pay his fees. And he did take those projects sometimes because they funded the projects that couldn't pay. The shelters. The community centers. The affordable housing complexes that made city councils nervous because they actually worked, actually gave people dignity, actually proved that you could house the homeless if you treated housing as a human right instead of a commodity. He thought about Margaret every time he drew a floor plan. Asked himself, would she be proud of this? Would this building serve people or just store them? And if the answer wasn't clear, he redesigned until it was. Samuel was 58. His hair was gray. His back hurt from decades of restaurant work. He could hire people to do everything now. Could sit in an office and make decisions without ever touching a stove. But he didn't. Couldn't. He still worked the line at his first restaurant 1 day a week. Still cooked. Still served. Still looked customers in the eye and asked if they'd eaten today because that question had saved his life once and maybe it would save someone else's now. His wife understood. His kids understood. This wasn't about the restaurant. This was about the promise. The promise to keep feeding people. To keep showing up. To keep proving that kindness wasn't extinct, just rare, and rarity made it more valuable, not less. They talked about Margaret constantly. With their families. With their employees. With reporters who asked about their success. There's no success without her, Marcus would say. Everything we built stands on a foundation she poured. People would nod and smile and assume it was exaggeration. Successful people always credited others. But the brothers weren't exaggerating. Weren't being humble for appearance's sake. They were being literal. Without Margaret, they'd be statistics. Dead or imprisoned or cycled through systems that destroyed more than they saved. She'd interrupted that trajectory. Altered their path through nothing more complicated than soup and consistency and the radical belief that they deserved care. The grandchildren were coming up now. Marcus's twins had kids of their own. Christopher's daughters were both mothers. Samuel's son was engaged. And the stories were being passed down. The great-grandmother who wasn't related by blood but by something stronger. The woman with a food cart who'd saved their grandfathers. The lesson that you don't need much to make a difference. Just consistency. Just care. Just the willingness to see people when everyone else looks away. The grandchildren would grow up knowing that their privilege came with responsibility. That their comfort was bought by someone else's sacrifice. That they owed a debt not to Margaret specifically but to the world she'd represented. The world where people mattered more than profit. Some of them rebelled against it. Too much pressure. Too much expectation. Too much living up to a legacy they didn't choose. Marcus's grandson went through a phase where he insisted success was about merit, not charity, and handouts made people weak. Marcus let him rant. Let him be 17 and certain and wrong. Then took him to volunteer at one of the restaurants on Thanksgiving. Made him serve food to people whose stories would break your heart if you listened. And afterward, in the parking lot eating cold turkey off paper plates, the kid had cried. "I didn't know," he'd said. "I didn't know it was like this." "Now you know," Marcus had replied. Question is what you do with the knowing. The kid went to law school. Joined Marcus's nonprofit. Was currently fighting a case about school lunch debt that was bankrupting families for the crime of feeding their children. He'd learned. They all learned eventually. Because the lessons Margaret taught weren't abstract. Weren't theoretical. They were visceral and real and impossible to ignore once you actually saw the people behind the statistics. Once you served food to someone who hadn't eaten in 3 days. Once you looked into eyes that had stopped expecting kindness and saw hope flicker when you provided it anyway. The brothers were aging. That was undeniable. Bodies that had survived childhood trauma were now surviving the slower trauma of time. Knees that gave warnings. Hearts that needed monitoring. The small betrayals of flesh that accumulated until mortality stopped being abstract and started being appointment reminders and medication schedules. They talked about succession planning. Who would run the foundation? Who would keep the restaurants true to their mission? Who would make sure the scholarship fund didn't become another bureaucracy that lost sight of its purpose? They had good people. Trusted people. But it wasn't the same. It would never be the same because no one else had lived the story. No one else had been those 3 boys on that corner. But maybe that was okay. Maybe that was even the point. The story didn't need to be lived to be understood. It needed to be told. Needed to be passed down. Needed to become the mythology that shaped behavior even after the original witnesses were gone. Every culture has stories about strangers who turn out to be angels, about kindness repaid, about the universe balancing scales. This was just another version. A true version. A version that happened on a street corner in a city that hadn't cared and to people who weren't supposed to matter. Marcus started writing it down. Not for publication. Just for the family. A record of what happened so the details wouldn't fade or get distorted over time. He interviewed his brothers. Tracked down people who'd known Margaret. Found the social worker, Diane Chen, who was 93 now but still remembered 3 boys she'd pulled from the streets and the woman whose cart had been the clue that someone cared. Diane cried when Marcus visited. "I've thought about you 3 so many times over the years. Wondered how you turned out. Most of my cases didn't end well. The system is broken. But you 3. You made it." "We had help," Marcus said. "We had Margaret. He found Mr. Patterson. Found Maria the nurse, who was retired now but still volunteered at the restaurant once a week because some habits were too good to break. Found Rosa's daughter, who said her mother had talked about Margaret until the day she died, always wondered what happened to the woman who'd refused to give up even when giving up made sense. Found vendors who'd mocked Margaret for feeding 3 street kids and now felt ashamed they'd been so short-sighted. Found customers who'd eaten at her cart daily and never knew they were witnessing something extraordinary until it was over. Collected all the fragments. All the perspectives. All the pieces of a life that had seemed small in the moment but was actually enormous in impact. The document ended up being 300 pages. Too long. Too detailed. But Marcus couldn't cut anything because every detail mattered. Every small choice Margaret had made was part of the pattern that had saved them. Leave out one detail and you might leave out the thing that inspired someone else to show up, to care, to believe that small acts accumulated into changed lives. He bound it. Made copies. Gave one to each family member. Donated one to the city archives. Put one in Margaret's Park under the plaque so anyone who wondered about the woman could read the story and understand. And people did read it. The park became a destination. Not tourist destination, but pilgrimage destination. People dealing with their own struggles would sit on the benches and read about Margaret and feel less alone. Less hopeless. If she could do it. If 3 abandoned kids could survive and thrive. If kindness could actually ripple through decades. Then maybe their own struggles weren't permanent. Maybe their own kindness mattered too. Maybe showing up was enough. The brothers watched this happen and marveled. Margaret would have been embarrassed. Would have insisted she wasn't special, that anyone would have done the same, except that clearly wasn't true because most people didn't do the same. Most people walked past need every day and called it practical. Called it realistic. Called it not my problem. Margaret had called it unacceptable and done something about it despite having almost nothing to give. That was special. That was rare. That was worth remembering. 20 years after Margaret died, the foundation hosted a gala. Normally the brothers avoided these things. Fundraisers felt too much like rich people congratulating themselves for doing the bare minimum. But this was different. This was celebrating 2 decades of impact. 2 decades of keeping Margaret's promise. The scholarship fund had sent over 1,000 students to college now. The restaurants had served 30 million free meals. The legal nonprofit had handled 20,000 cases. Christopher's firm had housed 60,000 formerly homeless individuals. The numbers were staggering. The impact was immeasurable. And it all traced back to a woman with a soup ladle and 3 hungry boys. The event was held at the first restaurant. The original location. The one that still had Margaret's restored cart on display in the corner, protected behind glass but visible to everyone. Scholarship recipients came. Legal clients came. Families living in Christopher's housing came. Restaurant customers came. 700 people crammed into a space meant for 100, and no one cared about fire codes because this was family. This was community. This was everyone whose life had been touched by Margaret's legacy gathering to say thank you and I remember, and this mattered. The brothers stood on a small stage, 3 men in their 60s looking remarkably like 3 boys who'd survived the impossible. Marcus spoke first. We gathered you here for a simple reason. To remember. To honor. To commit to continuing the work. He paused, emotion thick. Margaret saved our lives with soup and kindness and the revolutionary idea that we deserved care without earning it first. She's been gone 20 years, but her lesson lives in every meal we serve. Every case we win. Every building we design. Every scholarship we award. She's here. She's always here. And as long as we keep showing up, she always will be. Christopher spoke next. I design buildings for a living. I think about foundations constantly. About what holds things up. What makes structures stable. What allows them to last beyond the people who built them. He looked out at the crowd. Margaret is our foundation. The stability we build on. And this community, all of you, you're the structure. You're what lasts. You're what carries the lesson forward. So thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for caring. Thank you for proving that Margaret was right. That people matter. That kindness matters. That small acts done consistently create change that echoes through generations. Samuel spoke last. I'm a cook. I think in recipes. Ingredients that combine to create something greater than the sum of their parts. Margaret's recipe was simple. Show up. See people. Feed them. Care without calculating the return. And somehow, from those simple ingredients, she created this. He gestured at the room. A family. A movement. A proof of concept that the world can be better if we decide to make it so. His voice broke. I miss her. We all miss her. But missing her means she mattered. Means she left a hole that won't be filled. And instead of trying to fill it, we honor it. We keep the hole open. We point to it and say, this is what it looks like when someone extraordinary leaves. This is the space left by love. And we commit to living in ways that would make her proud. The crowd stood. Applauded. Cried. Strangers hugged strangers. People who'd been served free meals embraced people who'd served them. Scholarship recipients thanked donors who'd funded their education. Legal clients thanked lawyers who'd fought for them. And through it all, on display in the corner, Margaret's restored food cart stood as testament. As reminder. As physical proof that small things done with great love could change the world. The brothers stayed late. Long after the last guest left. Long after the staff cleaned up and went home. They sat at a table in the empty restaurant, sharing a bottle of wine that probably cost more than Margaret had earned in a month, and talked about her. About the woman who'd saved them. About how strange life was. How impossible to predict. How 3 homeless boys could become titans of industry and 3 Rolls-Royce cars could return to a street corner to repay a debt that could never actually be balanced. Do you think she knew? Christopher asked. Knew what? That feeding us would lead to all this. That her small act would ripple this far. Marcus shook his head. No. She couldn't have known. But that's what makes it matter. She didn't do it for the outcome. She did it because it was right. Because we were hungry and she had food. The ripples were just the universe rewarding what it should reward. Samuel raised his glass. To Margaret. To the woman who fed us when we were invisible. To the mother we found on a street corner. To the reason we're here. May we spend the rest of our lives trying to be worthy of her kindness. They drank. Sat in silence. And felt her presence in the way you feel the presence of people who've shaped you so completely that they're woven into your DNA. Margaret was in every decision they made. Every value they held. Every moment they chose kindness over convenience. She died 20 years ago, but she was more alive than most living people because she lived through them. Through their children. Through the thousands of lives they'd touched. Through the ripples that kept spreading outward, touching people who'd never heard her name but benefited from her lesson. The 3 brothers left the restaurant together. Walked to their cars, luxury vehicles that felt absurd and necessary at the same time. Absurd because they'd been the boys who had nothing. Necessary because success was how they'd built the platforms that let them help others. They hugged goodbye. Long hugs that held decades of trauma and triumph. Promised to see each other Sunday for dinner. Made plans for the next project, the next expansion, the next iteration of keeping Margaret's promise. And then they went home to their families, to the lives they'd built on the foundation of soup and kindness and a woman who'd refused to look away. This is where most stories end. With resolution. With the good people rewarded and the lesson learned and everyone living happily ever after. But life isn't stories, and the work Margaret started doesn't have an ending. Can't have an ending as long as people are hungry. As long as someone needs help and someone else has the capacity to provide it. As long as kindness remains a choice we have to make daily instead of a reflex we've mastered. The story continues. Will continue long after the brothers are gone. Long after their children and grandchildren. Because what Margaret taught wasn't dependent on her. It was a principle. A truth. A way of being in the world that worked regardless of who practiced it. The principle was simple. People matter. All people. Not just the ones who look like you or think like you or have resources you need. All of them. The homeless person on the corner. The single mother choosing between rent and food. The elderly veteran whose country forgot him after his service ended. The undocumented immigrant cleaning hotels at 3 in the morning. The teenager aging out of foster care with no family and no safety net. All of them matter. All of them deserve care. All of them are someone's child, someone's sibling, someone who had dreams before the world crushed them. And if they matter, then we have an obligation. Not a legal obligation. Not even a moral obligation that can be debated in philosophy classes. A human obligation. The obligation that comes from sharing this planet, sharing this brief existence, sharing the knowledge that any of us could be them with slightly different circumstances. We don't help because they deserve it, though they do. We don't help to feel good, though we might. We help because we're human, and humanity is defined by how we treat the most vulnerable among us. Everything else is just marketing. Margaret understood this without needing to philosophize about it. She saw hungry boys and fed them. Simple. Direct. No hand-wringing about dependency or enabling or whether they really deserved help. They were hungry. She had food. The math was that straightforward. And from that straightforward math came transformation. Not just their transformation. Hers too. Because giving changes the giver. Opens something. Creates a circuit where love flows both directions. The boys needed food. But Margaret needed purpose. Needed a reason to wake up when grief made sleep feel more appealing. Needed to believe her life still mattered after the person who'd made it matter was gone. They saved each other. That's how it works when it works right. The brothers knew this now in their 60s in ways they couldn't have known it as children. Knew that survival was never individual. That we're all connected by invisible threads of need and care and the small choices that pull us toward each other or let us drift apart. They'd spent their adult lives trying to strengthen those threads. Build systems that caught people before they fell too far. Create safety nets that actually worked instead of the performative nets that looked good in political speeches but held no weight. And they'd succeeded in ways Margaret never could have because they had resources she'd lacked. But the resources weren't the point. The point was the commitment. The daily choice to show up and care. Resources made it easier. Made the impact broader. But the small restaurant with limited resources serving 10 free meals was operating on the same principle as the foundation serving millions. Scale wasn't the measure. Consistency was. Showing up was. Seeing people was. Everything else was just details. This is what they tried to teach the next generation. Their children and grandchildren who'd grown up with privilege and comfort and every advantage the brothers hadn't had. They tried to teach them that privilege was responsibility. That comfort came with obligation. That advantages were meant to be shared, not hoarded. Some learned quickly. Some took longer. Some might never learn, might spend their lives accumulating instead of distributing, taking instead of giving. The brothers couldn't control that. Could only model what mattered and hope the modeling stuck. But even if their own children didn't carry it forward, others would. That was the beautiful thing about putting good into the world. It didn't need your family to continue. It found its own carriers. Infected people with the radical idea that kindness wasn't weakness. That caring wasn't foolish. That showing up mattered even when no one was watching and no one would know and the impact couldn't be measured. Those people were everywhere. Working quietly. Doing the small thing in front of them. Creating ripples they'd never see but that spread nonetheless. Think about it. Think about your own life. The moments that changed you. The people who shaped who you became. Were they the rich? The powerful? The famous? Or were they the ordinary people who showed up? The teacher who saw potential. The stranger who helped when they didn't have to. The friend who listened when talking was painful. The family member who loved you through your worst. Those people. Those small acts. Those moments that seemed insignificant at the time but turned out to be foundational. That's what Margaret was. That's what we all can be if we choose. The brothers understood that their success wasn't special. Wasn't rare. Wasn't some magical transformation that could only happen once. It happened because someone cared. Because someone created space for them to survive long enough to become who they were meant to be. And that could happen for anyone. For everyone. If we decided collectively that caring mattered more than convenience. That people mattered more than profit. That humanity was measured by how we treated our weakest members, not our strongest. But that required action. Required showing up. Required doing the uncomfortable thing, the inconvenient thing, the thing that didn't make financial sense or advance your career or earn social credit. It required being Margaret. Being the person who fed 3 boys because they were hungry and that was reason enough. No cameras. No audience. No reward except the knowledge that today, right now, in this moment, you made someone's existence a little less painful. And maybe, just maybe, that small act would ripple. Would spread. Would inspire someone else to care. And those ripples would spread until caring was normal instead of exceptional. Until kindness was default instead of remarkable. That was the dream. Not that everyone would be Marcus or Christopher or Samuel, titans in their fields changing systems from positions of power. But that everyone would be Margaret. Ordinary people doing extraordinary things through the accumulation of small choices. Feeding the hungry. Housing the homeless. Caring for the sick. Listening to the lonely. Seeing the invisible. Showing up day after day even when showing up was hard. Even when the impact couldn't be measured. Even when no one thanked you and no Rolls-Royce cars would ever arrive to repay the debt. Showing up anyway. Because that's what humans do. That's what we're supposed to do. Care for each other. Take turns being strong. Create safety through collective commitment to not letting anyone fall through the cracks. It was idealistic. The brothers knew that. Knew the world was more complicated than soup and kindness. Knew that systemic problems required systemic solutions. That individual charity couldn't replace functional government. That personal responsibility couldn't substitute for collective action. They knew all of that. But they also knew that Margaret had changed their lives with soup and kindness. Had done what the system couldn't or wouldn't. Had proven that waiting for the system to fix itself meant letting people suffer in the meantime. And that was unacceptable. So they operated on both levels. Fought for systemic change through their work. Better policies. Better laws. Better structures that didn't require individual heroes because heroes shouldn't be necessary. Everyone should have food and housing and healthcare and dignity as baseline, not as reward for luck or virtue. That was the goal. That was what they were building toward. But until that world existed, they'd keep being Margaret. Keep showing up. Keep feeding people. Keep proving that kindness mattered even in a world that often rewarded cruelty. The brothers were old now. That fact was unavoidable. Marcus was 63. Christopher 61. Samuel 59. The years they had left were finite and decreasing. They thought about death more now. Not morbidly. Just practically. Death was coming. For all of them. For everyone. The question wasn't whether. It was what you left behind. What ripples continued after you stopped being able to create them yourself. Marcus wanted to leave a legal system that worked better. Christopher wanted to leave buildings that housed people with dignity. Samuel wanted to leave a culture where feeding the hungry was normal, expected, celebrated. But more than that, they wanted to leave the lesson. The simple, profound, life-altering lesson that Margaret had taught them. That people matter. That kindness matters. That showing up matters. That small acts accumulate into changed lives. That you don't need wealth or power or influence to make a difference. You just need to care. Just need to do the thing in front of you. Just need to be present and attentive and willing to help in whatever way you can. If they could leave that lesson embedded deeply enough that it survived them, then their lives would have mattered. Not because of what they'd built. Not because of the money or the awards or the recognition. But because they'd taken Margaret's gift and multiplied it. Passed it forward. Created ripples that would continue long after they were gone. That was legacy. That was success. That was the point of existence. To leave the world slightly better. To help someone who needed help. To be the reason someone else's story had a better chapter. They talked about this often now. What came next? What happened when they were gone? Who would carry the torch? And they always reached the same conclusion. It didn't matter who specifically carried it. The lesson was in the world now. Embedded in thousands of lives. Taught in scholarship programs and legal clinics and community kitchens. Modeled by their children and grandchildren and the countless people they'd helped over decades of showing up. The lesson would survive because lessons that are lived survive better than lessons that are preached. And they'd lived it. God, they'd lived it. Every day. Every decision. Every choice to care when not caring would have been easier. Margaret had given them life. Not metaphorically. Literally. They would have died without her. Frozen or starved or been killed by the violence that claimed so many street kids. She'd interrupted that trajectory. Given them a chance. And they'd taken that chance and built lives that mattered. Lives that helped others. Lives that justified her faith in them even when they hadn't believed in themselves. That was the greatest gift they could give her memory. Not monuments or named buildings or bronze statues. But lives lived in alignment with her lesson. Lives that proved she'd been right to care. Right to show up. Right to believe that 3 hungry boys deserved a chance to become something more. And now, at the end of this story, though it's not really the end because stories like this don't end, we return to the question posed at the beginning. What happens when kindness is planted and left to grow? This happens. 3 boys become men who feed millions. A food cart becomes a foundation. A woman no one noticed becomes a legacy everyone studies. Small acts accumulate into transformation. And the universe, in whatever way the universe operates, rewards what should be rewarded. Not immediately. Not obviously. But eventually. Completely. Perfectly. Margaret never saw the full impact of her kindness. She fed 3 boys. Saw them disappear. Mourned them for 15 years. And then, when she was old and tired and ready to quit, they returned. Proved that her kindness had mattered. Had changed everything. Had rippled through time and space and circumstance to create a family, a foundation, a movement. She got 3 years in the restaurant. 3 years of seeing her lesson lived out. 3 years of understanding that her life had mattered beyond anything she'd imagined. And then she died, surrounded by the boys who were now men, held by the family she'd created through nothing more complicated than soup and showing up. That's the reward. Not wealth. Not fame. Not even gratitude, though that came too. The reward is knowing. Knowing your life mattered. Knowing your kindness made a difference. Knowing that the world is slightly better because you existed in it. That's what Margaret got. That's what the brothers gave her. That's what all of us can give each other if we choose. The knowledge that we're seen. That we matter. That our existence makes someone's life better just by being present and caring and showing up even when showing up is hard. So here's my question for you. What kindness have you delayed because you thought it was too small? What help have you withheld because you calculated the cost and decided it wasn't worth it? What person have you walked past without seeing because seeing would require doing something uncomfortable? Think about it. Really think about it. Because somewhere in your life is an opportunity to be Margaret. To be the person who shows up. Who cares? Who does the small thing that might not feel significant but could change everything for someone else? Drop a comment right now. Tell me, if you were in Margaret's position, would you have fed those boys? Would you have kept feeding them day after day even when it cost you? Be honest. And if this story moved you, if it made you think about your own life and your own choices and your own capacity for kindness, hit that subscribe button. Share this video. Let it ripple the way Margaret's kindness rippled. Let it spread until caring is normal and showing up is expected, and we've built a world where nobody has to be hungry because someone decided they matter. That's how we honor Margaret. That's how we honor every person who's shown up and cared and made a difference through small acts done with great love. Not by watching and nodding, but by doing. By being the change. By being the person who feeds the hungry boys on the corner even when no one's watching and no reward is coming. Because that's when it matters most. When you do it anyway. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me if you've been Margaret or if you've been the boys. Tell me how this story hit you. Because I want to know. We're building a community here of people who believe kindness matters. Who believe showing up matters. Who believe that ordinary people doing extraordinary things through accumulated small choices can actually change the world. Are you part of that community? Prove it. Comment. Subscribe. Share. And then, most importantly, go be Margaret for someone who needs it. Go show up. Go care. Go make someone's life slightly better just by being present and generous and willing to help. That's how stories like this continue. Not through watching. Through doing. Through being the next chapter in the story of kindness that never ends because we refuse to let it end. Until next time, remember, you don't need much to change someone's life. Just soup. Just kindness. Just the revolutionary belief that people matter. Everything else is just details. Now go out there and prove it. And I'll see you in the next video.